guess it's time to begin this morning. Give me one second here. Yes, it's time to begin, and I want to remember to do something I've been forgetting. About this whole class. Before we begin, who needs a workbook? One of our workbooks, How to Study the Bible. Who needs one? Raise your hand. Nobody? Doug, you want to? Doug will bring you one if you want one. You need one, Ryan? Okay. I bet Vernie might need one, and Sister Sinclair. He's got them right there. All right. Let's have a word of prayer when we get settled here, and then we'll begin. Heavenly Father, we're thankful we can be here this morning. Please help us as we read and study to have the right heart to think about you and to try to understand your word correctly and honorably. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So we're doing How to Study the Bible. It's a different approach than you might have be used to, and it's about this approach, as we'll see maybe even more so this morning, is not about just figuring out, learning the correct position on certain issues. That'll come. But it's about you yourself learning to read the Bible text. It's about the text. And all the other stuff comes from that eventually. So we're starting at ground level, very basic structural level here. That's why it's tedious and not done all the time, but we're starting at ground level. And I want you to see, we're going to briefly go over these real fast because I want to apply this and then move into the next section about how to begin to read. And that's some of the ways that God has taught our minds to put things. These are called the laws of composition. So everything that humans create, literature, art, architecture, music, all these forms of activity use the laws of composition. This isn't something humans made up. This was programmed, hardwired into our brains by God, who made our minds like His mind. Not equal to His mind, but like His mind, so we can think and He can communicate with us. At the very minimum, you can say that since God needed to communicate with us, He did so in a way that we can understand. And so He communicates what we can understand about His mind to our minds. How does He do it? He does it through specific statements, but all those statements are housed in laws of composition. Whether it's poetry, prose, whether it's commandments, whether it's just a story, all those things contain these elements. So one of them is principality. When you're looking at certain chapters, or books even, you see there's a main point to the book or to the chapter, and you don't miss it. Everything is going to that point, that main point, more so than others. And we used Revelation 4 and 5 about the throne of God there in those two chapters. The parables each have a main point. Don't miss the point. Everything coming from that, and so forth. Then we talked about repetition. Maybe the most common repetition is used throughout the whole Bible. It's used, all right, did Bach and Beethoven use repetition? Constantly. And that's how you follow their symphonies. You hear the repeating chords, or whatever they're called, melodies and things like that. You heard repeating sections, and that calls you back. Every kind of human columns on the Greek temples. That's repetition. You have it visually, you have it orally, you have it verbally in nature and in communication. That's how we communicate. Same thing in the Bible. And you see it in Matthew 5, you've heard it said, but I say unto you, you've heard it said, but I say unto you. That's one of them. There's many. 1 Corinthians 13, love is, love is, love is, love is. Right? In Revelation 2 and 3, you see this is what, let him that hath ears to hear, let him hear. Him that hath ears to hear, let him hear. He repeats it over and over again. There's a structure there. The structure of that chapter, Revelation 2 and 3, is built around that repetition. So look for it. When you see a repetition, your notes on the side, mark it and say, okay, or mark the words, repetition. Sometimes you'll begin to see things that, the repetition itself may not be the message, but the repetition shows you the message. All right, we'll come back to that. Progression, where things lead up to a certain point and then they fall away. We see this in all kinds of TV shows, movies, stories. Okay, are jokes, tell any kind of a joke, especially one that has any kind of little story with it. So what do we call the climax in a joke? Nobody knows? The punchline. That's the climax. All right? And then you might say something after that, but even in telling a joke, you build up the joke, you know, with a little bit like, why is a giraffe's neck so long, you know, and little suspense for the kids, and you say, so it'll reach all the way to his head. Okay, so that's that's a climax. So you have all these little jokes. So when you no. I'm thinking of my 7th grade, 8th grade classes I taught in school. I taught them all these jokes like that. Interchange. The famous book, I'm sure all of you have read it more than once, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Who knows the two cities? London and Paris, right? The two cities. Starts off, I think, in Paris. I could be wrong. Or London. I could be wrong. It goes to the other one. A couple chapters on that one. Then it goes. All of a sudden, you find yourself in Paris. Then it does that, and then it goes back to London, back and forth. And finally, after a little bit of that, what happens? You got a war, and you got everything together. Okay, or a love affair, whatever it may be. You see this all the time in human compositions. It's in the Bible, Luke 1 through 3. Angel comes to John the Baptist's father. Angel comes to Mary to announce a birth. Comes back to John the Baptist when John the Baptist is born. Goes back to Mary when Jesus is born. You see? And finally, the story settles on who? John the Baptist or Jesus? Settles on Jesus. That's interchange. And it's true in several of the Gospels. You see this story. Then you've got a radiation. Now, see, what I'm trying to convey to you is, I'm going to guess. This is not meant to be critical. Most of you don't see those kind of things in the Bible. You know a verse here, a verse there. You've heard this, you've heard that. You might know this story, that story. But the fact is, you don't see in a book that process because you haven't learned to read the book. That's what this is about. So you can read it and see this for yourself. Then you don't need me to tell you necessarily, or when I tell you, it makes sense to some things. I'll give you this is teasing, of course, sort of teasing. I'll give you a clue. You know, most things I say probably don't make sense to you. Just wait a while. It'll make sense. Time is coming when it's all going to be proven to be true. It'll make sense. But no, it does make sense in the Bible. But I want you to be able to find this for yourself, not just listen to me say something or memorize what I'm saying. That's not as good as you seeing these things in these stories or in these texts. And you can do it. I have no doubt that at all if you can learn practice this, learn a few of these things. And radiation is similar to principality. in that it's here you have more of a picture of like a sun or something, or you either have a sun where there's radiation going out, or you have the whirlpool going down the drain. Everything in the drain is circling around to go down the hole. You have that where it's going to an object or away from it. And you have the city of Jerusalem in the book of Acts. Everything comes from the city of Jerusalem. And things go back there a couple times, but they go away from the city of Jerusalem, which is a good point to make. Then there's contrast. This is probably the second most common thing, contrast. That's why you got two things over here. This, but this. You know, we'll see some more of these. The wicked are this way, but the righteous are this way. The book of Proverbs is filled with that. On a verse level, and then Psalms has chapters like this, and you see this whole thing. In the book of John, for example, it's a broader thing. You see belief and unbelief contrasted. And within a chapter, a few verses, or across a couple of chapters, you'll see belief and unbelief illustrated and talked about. You'll see light and darkness. Right in chapter 1, right? He was a light that comes into men and so forth. And the darkness tried to stuff it out, but I'm paraphrasing, but he couldn't. You see light and darkness all through the book of John. So you see these contrasts. Those are broader contrasts than something in the book of Proverbs. Then you have pivot or cruciality, where they lead up to a certain point, the events do, and then they drop off. This is more true in narratives, but not altogether true. The book of Revelation is like that. It all leads from the throne, and then there's 2 or 3 other points of cruciality in the book, but everything in the beginning of the book leads up to the throne scene, and then the seals under the altar, and once you get to the 6th seal in chapter 6, you see everything comes from that. And that kind of thing. All right, so we looked at Genesis 1. This is hard. This stuff is hard to show you up here. I haven't quite perfected it yet, but I do want to look again at this with you here. Go to Psalm 1. And I know it's small print up here, but maybe you can see the whole thing. I know there's a way to do this. And I can't, nothing seems to, it's there, it's probably easy, but I haven't spent the time to figure it out. I'm going to do that for next week, hopefully. Or I can mark it up as you see it, we can mark it up together. I don't want to buy some expensive markup software to do it, cheap. One of the laws of composition God used to make me was cheapness. So if it costs money, if it's free, I'll take 2. Free smack upside the head, oh, good, I'll take 2. All right. My what? Oh, the word is frugal now, not skinflint. Huh? Yeah. Well, there's another name for it, penurious. See, I can use fancy words and then sounds better to be penurious than to be, well, frugal sounds better than to be cheap, right? Same thing. And I got no problem being cheap. And then it's funny, other things I don't mind being whatever. All right. I mean, I pay like $14 or $15 for a haircut. That's unreasonably high. When I could get Andrew to cut it for free.
One woman's is down $250 to $350.
A woman's haircut? $350? $250?
Yeah, for a haircut.
Where are you shopping?
Where my daughter works.
I used to cut hair in college till somebody told me I wasn't allowed to do it because it was violating some union law, which really impressed me, of course. I was violating some union law. But
I was a hairstylist till 78, never got $200 for a haircut.
you did get $200?
I never did.
No, did
I
it?
would never. I would think I was robbing you.
That's Kim Kardashian's hairstylist.
Yeah, you got that right. Well,
Anyway, yeah, it's too expensive. You see these, you young men, you see all these nails? Run away.
Yeah.
Run away. That woman's going to spend $100 every 2 weeks on those nails.
$60
And that means she can't do nothing either because she's going to break her nails and you need her to do stuff for you. She needs to be able to help you change the tire and whatever, change the oil. How's she going to do that with nails? It's a signal. You can, anyway. I'll do my dating series later. Mike's tips on dating, modern dating. I'm getting the look, so I'm going to move on. All right, contrast from Psalm 1. Now let's read it. As we go along, see if you can find any of these laws of composition, and then we'll talk about it. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth its fruit in season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. The ungodly are not so. They are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the ways, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. Okay. Well, let's just look at verse 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scornful. Now, in some ways that's repetition. Because he's talking about a man, but he repeats three things about this that this person can do. It's also progression, Sharon. I think that's right. You're walking, you slow down and you stand, and then you sit down. That's a progression of your being comfortable with sin or ungodliness. So some people are walking by and looking at wrongdoing, and they don't just turn away, they keep looking. Other people, when they see that, they stop and take a good look at it. And other people just sit right down. Okay? But the ungodly, the sinners, and the scornful they're different, but it's the same kind of person. But they're different degrees of the same thing. You can look it up. Now then it says, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. I see two there. What's the first one you see? But, the contrast, when you see that word, it's a contrast. Well, what's the contrast? But his delight is in the law of the Lord. Who's that? What's that word? If I was going to draw a line, now the but has to go backwards to something previous. If I was going to draw a line from but his delight, where would I draw it back to mentally? Blessed is the man, right? That man's blessed. So that man, his delight's in the law of the Lord. He's not walking and standing and sitting in the way of sinners. His delight's in the law of the Lord. See the contrast? And in his law he meditates day and night. That's kind of a repetition, isn't it? It's an expansion too. His delight's in the law of the Lord, and then he expands it and he says he meditates in this law day and night. So you kind of get a visualize of an expansion of a giving you more detail about it than just something simple. Who's the he in verse 3? Who's the he? Not the wicked man, right? He's talked about the wicked man, but about the wicked man, you draw a line in your head or physically on your paper. Of course, we're going to do that. We're going to draw these lines later, really, but we're going to do it mentally right now. The he goes back to the blessed man in verse 1. He shall be... What's that? Somebody's talking, but I can't hear you. Happy is the man. Okay, happy and blessed are synonyms for each other. That's correct. Happy probably does... In American English in the 21st century, happy does not convey the depth of the joy of blessed or joy, does it? Happy is like a Happy Meal. Okay? I'm happy my pizza had extra pepperoni. Does it give me lasting joy? Well, it might if I was that shallow, but I mean, pizza can bring you joy. I don't doubt that, but it's a different. But now on the other hand, it is true. I would say Sister, to the Hebrews back then, the word happy and blessed were very close. We kind of we use them differently, but back then, happy and blessed, or when Jesus says blessed are the merciful, same word, same concept, same thing. Do you have a hand up? Okay. Yes. So the he then goes back to the blessed man. He shall be like a tree. Now we haven't even come to similes and metaphors yet. A metaphor is, he is an oak. Well, is he really an oak? He is a tree. Is he really a tree? Not unless you're dealing with Lord of the Rings and the tree beard, but he is not a tree. It's a metaphor for a man being like a tree as opposed to being like a weed, for example. He's a tree. So we know in our minds what image is being conveyed by that, metaphorically, to spiritual qualities. Now then, he is like a tree is a simile. It's similar. Like and as. The book of Revelation is filled with the word as, that premillennialists always take to mean, they forget that word's there. It'll say the sea was as crystal. Oh, it's a crystal sea. That's not exactly what it says. It was like crystal in some way. Now, I may be wrong about that specific case, but like. Like is not the same thing as is. And it certainly isn't concrete. It's like something. You see like a wheel within a wheel in the sky. Not a wheel. Like a wheel. We're going to come back to this. He's like a tree planted by the rivers of water. Not just any old tree, but one planted by rivers of water. What would be this? Well, he's talking about depth, and it brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf does not wither. Now see, you can put this tree here and you can list these qualities. This is how preachers write sermons if they're any good. You got these qualities. Well, how are you like a tree? Well, you're by rivers of water, you bring forth fruit in your season, your leaf doesn't wither, and whatever you do shall prosper. You got 4 points to your sermon already, see?
That's the opposite if it was planted in the desert.
What's that?
That's the opposite if it was planted in the desert.
Right. It's not planted in just some shallow, or the contrast, Doug, is like the one, he says like not being planted in the desert, and that's true. It's like the one where the seed fell on the rocky again, it sprung forth right away, but there's no moisture underneath, so it withered. This tree is by water, it's not going to wither. They had such a bad drought up in, I think, some parts of Georgia, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe my geography is wrong here. Someone was telling me recently that this summer for a few months, and some of the trees died. That was Texas. Some of the trees died. They were worried about a lot of others because they apparently their roots weren't quite deep enough to get into the groundwater, and those trees died because it was so dry. Now, this kind of tree, it's planted, its roots go deep enough, it can't die. No matter what happens around it, it can't die. The ungodly are not so. Now, what is this now? He doesn't use the word but it's a contrast, isn't it? But, you could say, and for me, some version says that, but the ungodly are not so. Now, who's the contrast? There's a contrast between ungodly and who? First, back to verse 3, the man like a tree. Back to verse 2, the one who delights in the law of the Lord. And back to verse 1, blessed is the man. There's the line goes all the way down now as a contrast to the ungodly are not so. They're like the chaff, meaning they have similarities to chaff, which is just the hull which blows away. Anybody ever have a parakeet or a cockatoo? They eat all their seeds. And my grandmother had a canary same way. She put up a net screen around it because the bird will flap its wings and all those little feathers. Not just feathers, all the little husks, not the seeds, even just the husks of the seeds will go flying off all over the room. And that's the chaff. Okay? That's the broken hulls. When you get the good seed out, you got that left. Sometimes the seeds, if they're small enough.
Mine says, therefore, the ungodly shall not stand. Therefore.
No, that's the next verse, verse 5. Therefore. Now that's right. So therefore, because of these two things, they can't stand. Well, why? Well, the one man's got his roots deep in the water, or deep into the ground in the water. The other one's like chaff. Well, because he's like chaff, how do ungodly people live in society in general? Whatever is popular, whatever everybody else does, they go and do. They're unstable. They go wherever society is leading. If society says you wear these clothes this year and you throw them all away and buy new ones next year, they do that. Okay? Or this is moral this year, it's not moral next year, they change. But therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment. They can't stand up to judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the right. So you got ungodly and sinners again, back to verse 1. See the same words being repeated? Ungodly and sinners from verse 1 to verse 5. For the Lord, now then here's his conclusion. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. So that's the conclusion paragraph. All right, we're going to break this down even further a little bit. You see how the laws of now, so you have, what's the big contrast here? There's one big contrast. What is it? It's obvious. The ungodly and the righteous. Ungodly man, the righteous or blessed man. That's the contrast in this psalm. Now you can read each verse by itself and you can do all this, but you can't miss that or you'll miss it all. Now if you spend some time thinking through this verse, then now that you begin to see this, if you read this carefully, break some of these things down, write this out, and prayed about these things and thought about them, you would be greatly benefited. This is how God leads off the whole book of Psalms, with this whole psalm. So it's a lot in here that's basic and valuable. All right, real quickly then, let's take Luke 12. Go all the way to the New Testament. Luke 12, Jesus, this is a long, well, there's more to the context. Let me. Was that midnight coffee I had this morning, or was that regular coffee? Dunkin' Donuts has this new coffee called midnight coffee, which means it's really strong. It's not quite up to Starbucks strong, but it's also not up to Starbucks price. Okay, so there's a plus. But it's pretty strong and it makes me thirsty. Plus at least three kinds of allergy medicine help this morning. Sorry about that, pardon me. All right, Luke 12:16. Then he, that's Jesus in the, you'll know that if you were looking at Luke. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? And he said, here's the he, rich man, he in verse 17, he in verse 18, and he said, I will do this. I'll pull down my barns and build greater. There I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, what do you see here? Contrast. Big contrast. But God said to him, fool, or thou fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will these things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So this psalm has a lot of parables and word picture, or this parable has a lot of word pictures in it, tearing down barns, building them up, saying this to yourself, talking to yourself, eat, drink, and be merry. We use that phrase today, see, about a way of living. But God said, boy, those are the biggest contrast words in the entire Bible, and there are quite a few times it says, but God, or but God said. And when you see those, you need to stop and really back up. When you see but God, you need to stop and back up, say, wait a minute, let me make sure I'm getting what's ahead of this, and knowing what's beyond this. So you can say to yourself, I got all I need, I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry, I'm going to retire, young, got my life ahead of me, going to travel, going to do this, going to do that. No one's going to tell me what to do anymore.
But God said,
But God said, sometimes it works out the way you say, sometimes it doesn't. And so, but God said, fool. Now this man wasn't a righteous man who lived his life according to God's will, and because God blessed him, he accumulated wealth and prosperity, and he loved God and served his fellow man. That's not this man. What's the focus of this man? Himself. Always had been himself and what he wants and what his desires are. That man is a fool. That's what this is saying. Because who will these things be? They won't be yours for sure. And even Proverbs says you'll leave your riches to a fool half the time. How many wealthy men, billionaires, other rich men, have a son or sons that just are almost worthless and squander all their wealth? And it's common. Always been common. How many kings have had successful sons who were kings? Not that many. A few have. But oftentimes they're raised, and I admire rich people, and I know a few, known of a few, I should say, who make their kids work, make their kids do things. Well, there's a famous story from around here. Most of you weren't here then. I was not here quite then. The Evinrude engine manufacturing, Mr. Evinrude lived here in Jensen Beach. Millionaires, multimillionaires. And his daughter was working at a 7-Eleven, or his granddaughter. I think his granddaughter was working at a 7-Eleven right where I live. And was kidnapped out of there and killed out of the 7-Eleven. Now my first thought is, why was that? She was a twin? Yeah. Why is she working at a 7-Eleven? But, well, and he probably was right. She wanted to be independent, and he was fine with that. Now, you hate that happened, but on the other side, there's something good to be said about that she was out trying to live her own life and not just depend on Daddy's money. So,
Her twin worked at the gas station.
Twin worked at a gas station?
Yeah, she worked at the gas station, not too far from where we live at school.
Yeah. So you get that whole thing. Now anyway, that's what this parable is about. But you see, there's really only a big contrast here. There's not a lot. There's other laws of composition, but they're not as detailed as the one in the Psalms. So not every verse is going to have all of that in it like the Psalm 1 did. Some are just fundamental. But if you don't get the contrast, you're going to miss this parable. See, there's one point to the parable again. One point. You know, who shall these things be? So is he who is rich toward God, who's not rich toward God, lays up treasure for himself. There's the point. Verse 21 is the point of the parable. That's the one thing you should get. All right, now, I don't know how much time we have, just a minute or two left, but the next section here, and we're going to keep using these, we're not done with these, but we're going to move on a little bit. We're going to do paragraphing and outlining. It just sounds terrible. It sounds like a root canal, doesn't it? Or worse. How many of you lived in here said, well, outline this chapter for tomorrow? Nobody can do that. I can do that because I learned how to do it. It's just simple, huh? It's hard to do that for most people. But we're going to show you how even this uneducated crew can learn how to do this.
But it makes you understand what you're reading.
It makes you understand what you're reading. That's the point I'm trying to get at. It's just mental training. You won't have to do this on paper all the time. You can eventually learn to do it just as a matter of course as you read. Every single one of you can. Now, there'll be varying degrees of ability in this, but this is where we're going next, and we're going to use what we've already seen about the paragraphs and the sections. We're going to use that now as a building block, and then, remember we had you give a name to that paragraph about Mary and about, now we're going to use this going forward, the next step. So that's where we'll begin next week, the Lord willing, on this next step of breaking the chapter or book down into paragraphs and we're going to break it down and put it back together again. You all like Legos. We're going to break it all down, put it all back together again. Okay? It's not as hard as it sounds, so just be patient with me. All right, thank you very much. What's that?
Lego, not Lego. Lego is the name of something. It's Lego bricks, Lego structure. It's just
Like Walmart.
Yeah.
Like Walmart's?
It's not plural.
It's not plural.
It's a title.
You know, I'm trying to describe